What is a truly socialist society? What must be done for a social revolution to abolish capitalist value production? What does Marx's concept of socialism as the achievement of freely associated relations of production mean for today? We can no longer take these questions for granted. We no longer live in an era when we can assume the opponents of capitalism have the same basic understanding of what constitutes a new society, and that the differences between them mainly concern issues of tactics and strategy. The numerous revolutions of the 20th century that nationalized property and curbed the power of the free market, but failed to abolish value production and alienated labor, call on us to re-examine with new eyes the very content of socialism itself. This cannot be achieved solely through a critique of capitalism's defects, crucial as that is. To meet the challenge of our times, we must explore what is socialism as a philosophical question. A critical reading of the work of Rosa Luxemburg can greatly aid this effort. Luxemburg not only developed one of our Luxemburg not only developed one of the earliest theories of the globalization of capital, but she also was one of the foremost critics of bureaucracy and reformism, as well as of statist tendencies within the revolutionary Marxist movement. From her polemic against Edward Bernstein's reformism in 1898 to Karl Kautsky's failure from 1910 to endorse radical mass action, and from her polemics with Lenin over organizational centralism to her critique of the Russian Revolution in 1918, she projected a vision of liberation that in many respects transcended the horizons of orthodox Marxism. Perhaps more than any other dimension of her work, the expansiveness of her vision of freedom and human liberation, central to which is her insistence that there is no democracy without socialism and no socialism without democracy, speaks to us today. Any effort to explore Luxemburg's concept of a post-capitalist society, however, faces several problems. First, like most Marxists of her historic era, Luxemburg was confident that history would compel a new society to arise, making it unnecessary to speculate about the future. Partly for that reason, her work contains no lengthy or systematic discussion of socialism. The reluctance to directly address the content of a socialist society predominated among virtually all of the tendencies of the Second and Third Internationals. It was taken for granted that Marx's criticism of the utopian socialists and his strictures against creating, quote, blueprints about the future, end quote, meant that it was pointless, if not counterproductive, to speculate about the post-capitalist society. It was wrongly assumed that since Marx never directly discussed the forms that would define a socialist society, there was even less reason for his followers to do so. Why risk falling prey to utopian speculations when the growing concentration and centralization of capital and the socialization of labor were inexorably leading to the formation of a socialist society in any case? This reluctance to address in any detail the alternative to capitalism persisted even after the revisionism controversy of 1898 to 1899. Luxemburg brilliantly demolished Bernstein's claim that the growing role of credit in accelerating the centralization of capital meant that capitalism would give way to socialism on its own, by showing that such factors only sharpened the contradictions of capital in a way that made social revolution more imperative. The dispute did not, however, touch on how Bernstein or the other revisionists conceived of socialism itself. At issue was the means by which to reach it. The same was true of Luxemburg's emphatic break with Kautsky in 1910 over his advocacy of, quote, strategy of attrition, end quote, in place of revolutionary action, a break that preceded Lenin's rupture with Kautsky by 4 years. Remember that, kids. Second, the predominant view in the Second International, and in much of what called itself Marxism in the decades that followed, was that capitalism is defined by the anarchy of the market, and socialism is defined by collective or state control of the means of production. This view also characterized much of Luxemburg's work. This is especially seen from her Introduction to Political Economy and her book The Accumulation of Capital. She wrote in the former, Introduction to Political Economy, that in capitalism there is, quote, the disappearance of any kind of authority in economic life, any organization in planning and labor, any kind of connection between the individual members, end quote. She argued, quote, there is indeed still today an overpowerful lord that governs working humanity, capital. But its form of government is not despotism, but anarchy, end quote. This juridical counterpoising of plan versus planlessness as the absolute class opposites falls short of Marx's view of socialism as the abolition of value production through freely associated labor. It is not that Luxemburg was unaware of the central importance of production relations and the social form of labor in the Marxian critique of capitalism. She was a studious enough follower of Marx to know that, quote, but all these aspects of economic life are themselves determined by one decisive factor, production. The fact that the distribution of products in exchange can only be a consequent phenomenon is apparent at first glance. Production itself is therefore the first and most important element in a society's economic life, end quote. However, if this is the case, then it is not the anarchy of the market, quote, anarchy of the market, that is the decisive issue in capitalism, but rather the despotic plan of capital at the point of production. The, quote, anarchy of the market, which is indeed a determining factor in social life, conceals, according to Marx, the determining factor, the forced character of alienated labor. While Luxemburg fully understood, in general, the priority of social relations of production over exchange in the market, when it came to her specific enumeration of the dynamics of capitalism, she emphasized the anarchic character of exchange to the point of contending that there is, quote, the disappearance from the capitalist economy of any kind of plan or organization, end quote. Influenced as she was by the prevailing orthodoxy that treated, quote, anarchy and, quote, despotism as absolute opposites, instead of as mutually reinforcing tendencies, the despotic plan of capital at the point of production dropped out of sight. This was not only true of Luxemburg, of course. It was true of the Second International as a whole, and it was recognized as a problem by Engels from its very inception. The 1891 Erfurt Program, which served as the programmatic and theoretic basis of German social democracy, referred to, quote, the planlessness rooted in the nature of capitalist private production, end quote. In Engels' sharp criticism of the program, written in 1891 but not published until 1901, Engels wrote in response, quote, capitalist production by joint stock companies is no longer private production, but production on behalf of many associated people. And when we pass on from joint stock companies to trusts, which dominate and monopolize whole branches of industry, this puts an end not only to private production, but also to planlessness, end quote, Engels. However, that lack of planlessness does not make the society any less capitalistic. Yet despite this, Luxemburg persisted in claiming that, quote, anarchy is the life element of the rule of capital, end quote. Luxemburg's counterpoint of, quote, market anarchy, capitalism, to, quote, planned production, socialism, clearly limited her delineation of the alternative to capitalism. Much of her Introduction to Political Economy, the book, is devoted to showing that generalized relations of market exchange led to and produced the fragmented, indirect, and exploitative conditions of capital. Jesus Christ, let me repeat that whole sentence. Much of her book, Introduction to Political Economy, is devoted to showing that generalized relations of market exchange led to and produced the fragmented, indirect, and exploitative conditions of labor that characterize modern capitalism. The logical conclusion of the analysis suggests that a socialist society will arise quasi-automatically from the abolition of, quote, market anarchy, even though she sharply critiqued in the same work bourgeois thinkers for only focusing on exchange relations. Luxemburg was not incorrect in her historical analysis of the rise of capitalism in the West, that capitalist relations of production did indeed arise as the result of the impact of a, quote, free and, quote, anarchic market. However, the historical origin of a phenomenon is not the same as the phenomenon's logical determination. Once capitalism becomes predominant, it can persist long after, quote, market anarchy is overcome, so long, that is, as the despotic plan of capital at the point of production is left intact. Marx himself pointed to this in Capital, in noting that even the concentration and centralization of capital in a single hand, which would of course mean the effective end of a, quote, anarchic market, would not change by one iota the logic of capital. It is therefore not surprising that Luxemburg, like her contemporaries, did not feel impelled to say much about the content of socialism in such works as The Introduction to Political Economy, for she, like her contemporaries in the Second International, largely took it for granted that, quote, socialism would spring into existence once the, quote, free market was abolished. Nonetheless, despite such limitations, Luxemburg went much further than other Marxists of the period by insisting that Marx's work, especially Capital, is best understood not as an analysis of capitalist development, but as a delineation of its process of dissolution. As she put it in the Introduction to Political Economy, quote, if it is the task and object of political economy to explain the laws of the origin, development, and spread of the capitalist mode of production, it is an unavoidable consequence that it must, as a further consequence, also discover the laws of the decline of capitalism, which, just like previous economic forms, is not of eternal duration, but is simply a transition phase of history, a rung on the endless ladder of social development. The doctrine of the emergence of capitalism thus logically turns into the doctrine of the decline of capitalism. The science of the mode of production of capital into the scientific foundation of socialism. The theoretical means of the bourgeoisie's domination into a weapon of the revolutionary class struggle for the liberation of the proletariat. End quote. Even more important, Luxemburg understood that Marx was able to successfully present capitalism's tendency towards dissolution and self-destruction because he analyzed it from the vantage point of a socialist future. She wrote in Reform or Revolution, quote, the secret of Marx's theory of value, of his analysis of money, his theory of capital, his theory of the rate of profit, and consequently the whole existing economic system is the final goal, socialism. And precisely because a priori, Marx looked at capitalism from the socialist viewpoint, that is, from the historical viewpoint, Marx was enabled to decipher the hieroglyphics of capitalist economy. End quote. She restated this in a review of Marx's theories of surplus value in 1905. Quote, it was Marx who utterly transformed the position vis-a-vis his object of investigation. The position of the socialist who glances over the boundaries of the bourgeois economic form from a higher viewpoint. In short, it was the dialectic method of Marx which created the possibility of bringing analysis to bear on the particular problems of economics. End quote. Although Luxemburg rarely had much to say about the content of a socialist society, aside, that is, from discussing the need to abolish, quote, market anarchy through, quote, planned production, Luxemburg nevertheless understood that the inner workings of existing society could not be fully unraveled unless they were critiqued from a conceptual standpoint infused with a vision of a socialist future. This is part and parcel of the great stress she placed on ideas and consciousness in producing social transformations. In contrast to the vulgar materialism that characterized so many of her contemporaries, she argued that the creation of a new social system and modes of production is never a blind and unconscious process. The ability of the bourgeoisie to throw off the fetters of absolutism, which is so important for the unfolding of capitalism as a global system, could not have occurred, she argued, without such intellectual revolutions as the Enlightenment that preceded it. Quote, Political economy, along with the philosophical, social, and natural rights theories of the Age of Enlightenment, was above all a means for acquiring self-consciousness, a formulation of the class consciousness of the bourgeoisie, and as such, a precondition and impulse for the revolutionary act. End quote. Thus, as the quote, self-consciousness attained by the bourgeois classes was a precondition of their ability to gain social dominance over the proletariat, so the self-consciousness and theoretical knowledge of the proletariat will enable it to achieve dominance over the bourgeoisie. Integral to this, quote, self-knowledge is the need to, quote, look at capitalism from the socialist viewpoint, end quote. Hence, even if Luxemburg did not issue as detailed or comprehensive a vision of an alternative to capitalism as demanded by today's realities, she did adequately point to the overall challenge facing us. Luxemburg stressed from her earliest work on the need to grasp the present from the vantage point of a future new society also informed her understanding of spontaneous mass activity. This took on special importance with her development of the theory of the mass strike during and after the 1905 Russian Revolution. She wrote, quote, not through formal prohibitions or through discipline, but only by the maximum development of mass action, whenever and wherever the situation permits, a mass action which brings into play the broadest masses of the proletariat. Only in this way can the clinging mist of parliamentary cretinism, of alliances with the middle classes, and the rest of the petty bourgeois localism be gotten rid of. End quote. As she argued in her 1906 The Mass Strike, the Party, and the Trade Unions, this meant that organization no longer takes precedence over spontaneity, since, quote, revolutions do not allow anyone to play the schoolmaster to them, end quote. The, quote, intellectual sediment, end quote, produced by the spontaneous struggle is as important as the struggles themselves. Once again, quote, self-consciousness, self-knowledge, and class consciousness, end quote, are viewed as central components of the struggle against capitalist domination. This conception also informed her polemics with Lenin over the question of organization. She wrote, quote, socialist transformation is not something for which a ready-made formula lies completed in the pocket of the Revolutionary Party, end quote. She critiqued Lenin for failing to see that the idea of socialism, quote, implies a complete reappraisal of our organizational concepts, a completely new concept of centralism, a completely new notion of the mutual relationship between organization and struggle, end quote. Luxemburg and Lenin were by no means opposed on all issues, including on organization. In fact, the period of their closest collaboration between 1905 and 1907 followed her sharp critique of Lenin's, quote, centralism in, quote, organizational questions of Russian social democracy. At the same time, the extent of her differences with Lenin on this question should not be underestimated. She wrote in Credo, a manuscript of 1911, that has only recently been discovered, quote, we felt obliged to stand up decisively against the organizational centralism of Lenin and his friends because they wanted to secure a revolutionary direction for the proletarian movement by swaddling the party in a purely mechanistic fashion with an intellectual dictator from the Central Party executive, end quote. Luxemburg's critique addressed more than a tactical issue. It addressed how to avoid reproducing the capitalist division of labor in revolutionary movements by confronting the, quote, great popular mass with a goal that transcends the whole existing order, end quote. Many radicals have affirmed freedom and democracy as the goal of struggle, while creating organizations defined by a strict division of labor between workers and intellectuals and theorists and activists. As a result, the hallmark of class society, the division between mental and manual labor, defines their organizational structures. It is therefore no accident that when such groups take power, the hierarchical division of labor is left untouched. Luxemburg understood that rigid organizational centralism threatens to reproduce the oppressive and social relations of capitalism. As she put it in her critique of Lenin, quote, means turn against the end, end quote. Means turn against the end. Nevertheless, Luxemburg's critique of organizational centralism and praise of spontaneous self-activity coexisted uneasily with the view that socialism is defined by collective or state control of the means of production. As many revolutions since 1917 have shown, state or collective ownership of the means of production by no means negates organizational centralism from above, just as it does not necessarily allow for spontaneous self-activity from below. Luxemburg did not explicitly address this issue, nor is it a surprise that she did not do so, since only after 1917 was she confronted with a successful seizure of power by socialists. Nevertheless, there was an unresolved tension between Luxemburg's expansive embrace of spontaneous mass self-activity and her tendency to adhere to the traditional view that socialism is defined by juridical factors, like the replacement of private property by collective or state ownership. Her emphasis on the full and free expression of mass creativity is inseparable from the goal of socialism. Sorry, I got spaced out. Nevertheless, there was an unresolved tension between Luxemburg's expansive embrace of spontaneous mass self-activity and her tendency to adhere to the traditional view that socialism is defined by juridical factors, like the replacement of private ownership by collective or state ownership. Luxemburg's emphasis on the full and free expression of mass creativity is inseparable from the goal of socialism appears to be dialectically out of sync with the tendency, often expressed in her economic and historical writings, to pose plan versus planlessness as the absolute class opposites. In fact, at least in her writings up to 1917, Luxemburg discussed the relation between means and ends relatively rarely. It is far more common for her to focus on the notion of root cause or causality. This is especially seen in her accumulation of capital, which aimed to uncover the root cause of imperialism. Her repeated emphasis on presenting the root cause of a phenomenon is also seen in the mass strike pamphlet, which focused on the relation between economic and political causality. Quote, cause and effect here continually change places, end quote. Causality is a crucial category, but is not the defining principle of dialectics. As Hegel put it in his Science of Logic, quote, cause is the highest stage in which the concrete notion, as beginning, has an immediate existence in the sphere of necessity, but it is not yet a subject, end quote. In other words, discovering the root cause of a phenomenon, while important, does not by itself illuminate the relation between the means needed to pursue an end and the content of the end itself. To probe that relation, we must go beyond causality by grappling with the subjectivity of self-liberation, the specific nature of the goal itself. Toward the end of her life, in the short but tumultuous period that spanned from the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 to her death in January 1919, Luxemburg's work took on a new depth in that she began to project a more expansive view of socialism. This was largely in response to the events in Russia and the German Revolution of 1918, in contrast to the 1905 Russian Revolution, which Luxemburg, like all Marxists, saw as putting bourgeois democratic demands on the agenda. The Russian and German revolutions of 1917 to 1918 raised the perspective of creating a socialist society. Luxemburg therefore began to more directly address the difficult task of envisioning the specific content of a post-capitalist society. I get to hear the noise of my household in the background. Everyone's busy while I'm being an asshole in here. In November 1918, she wrote that making real, quote, the social order of socialism, end quote, is, quote, a huge work which cannot be completed in the twinkle of an eye by a few decrees from above. It can be born only of the conscious action of the mass of workers, end quote. She added, quote, the path of the revolution follows clearly from its ends. Its method followed from its task, end quote. On this basis, she called, quote, for all power in the hands of the workers and soldiers' councils, end quote. Shortly thereafter, she issued one of her fullest discussions of a post-capitalist society in an essay entitled, quote, The Socialization of Society. As always, she focused on the need for the working class to, quote, get the entire political power of the state into its own hands, end quote. However, she did not stop there. She wrote, quote, political power, however, is for us socialists only a means. The end for which we must use this power is the fundamental transformation of the entire economic relations, end quote. This entails, she said, abolishing private property and transforming it into the, quote, common property of the people, end quote. However, she now noted that this is only, quote, the first duty of a workers' government. That's a typo. That's not me. However, she now noted that this is only, quote, the first duty of a workers' government, end quote. Once collective property replaces private property, quote, only then does the real and most difficult task begin, the reconstruction of the economy on a completely new basis, end quote. Clearly, by 1918, Luxemburg had moved some distance from the idea that socialism is defined by collective property and a state plan. She now went further by focusing on the need to create a new kind of labor. She wrote that in socialism, work itself must be organized quite differently than in capitalism, where, quote, one only goes to work because one has to, because it is the means to live, end quote. In socialism, work becomes an end in itself. Thus, quote, enthusiasm for work must be given the greatest consideration, end quote. Luxemburg's emphasis on the need to transform the very activity of laboring is remarkable, considering that no one at that time knew of Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, in which Marx pinpointed the abolition of alienated labor as the defining feature of a truly humanist post-capitalist society. Marx argued in 1844 that the alienation of the product from the producer, as expressed in the difference between the value of labor power and the value of the total product, is not the central problem of capitalism. The central problem, he argued, is the alienated character of the very activity of laboring. The fact that labor becomes a mere means to an end instead of an end in itself. Post-Marx Marxists, however, were not raised on this conception. They generally paid little attention to the alienated character of the activity of laboring, as shown in that even Lenin proposed utilizing, quote, Taylorism, the scientific management of production that characterized Fordist production techniques of developed capitalism after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Given the lack of access to Marx's view that changing property forms and market relations amount to little without an uprooting of the alienated character of work relations themselves, Luxemburg's stress on how, quote, enthusiasm for work must be given the greatest contribution, end quote, is striking. Throughout the last months of her life, she insisted, quote, the proletariat must do more than stake out clearly the aims and direction of the revolution. It must also personally, by its own activity, bring socialism step by step into life, end quote. As against those who, quote, imagined it would be only necessary to overthrow the old government and then to inaugurate socialism by decree, end quote, she wrote, quote, socialism will not and cannot be created by any government, however socialistic. Socialism must be created by the masses, by every proletarian. Only that is socialism, and only thus can socialism be created, end quote. This perspective also defined Luxemburg's critique of the Bolsheviks in 1918, the critique of whom she never disowned despite claims to the contrary. Although she supported the Bolshevik Revolution, she sharply critiqued Lenin and Trotsky for treating democracy as a, quote, cumbersome mechanism, to be discarded at will. She fervently opposed the shutting down of opposition newspapers, the banning of leftist political parties, and the formation of the secret police, the Cheka, the institution that turned out to become the training ground for so many of Stalin's later functionaries. In her 1918 The Russian Revolution, she took issue with, quote, a dictatorship of the party, end quote, calling instead for the, quote, most active, unlimited participation of the masses of the people, of unlimited democracy, end quote. This was no idealist illusion on her part. It was a realistic understanding that the capital relation cannot be eliminated from above by even the best leaders of parties, since capital is not simply a material object, but the expression of a social relation of domination and alienation. The developments, as well as contradictions found in Luxemburg's work of 1918 to 1919, show themselves most of all in her effort to turn anew to Marx. Just as after the 1905 revolution, she explored Marx's praxis during the 1848 revolutions. So in 1918, she turned anew to Marx's work. In attacking the programmatic standpoint of German social democracy since its founding in her speech to the formation of the German Communist Party in December 1918, she singled out Marx's statement in the 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto that, quote, "The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes," end quote. This represented a departure from Marx's earlier position articulated in the 1847 edition of the Manifesto that emphasized the need for the proletariat to centralize control over the existing institutions of the state. Clearly, Luxemburg's position of the inseparability of socialism and democracy led her to appreciate the importance of previously neglected dimension of Marx's own work. Oddly enough, however, Luxemburg did not explicitly refer to Marx's critique of the Gotha program, which contained Marx's fullest discussion of a post-capitalist society. In his 1875 critique, Marx stated that even in the first initial stage of a post-capitalist society, that is still, quote, tainted with the diseases of the old society, end quote, there is no value production, no market, and no hierarchical social control of labor. This is a very different position from that of many Marxists, including Trotsky, who argued that, quote, the capitalistic measure of value and all the consequences ensuing thereon, quote, end quote, also operated in a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Why did Luxemburg's re-examination of Marx in the last weeks of her life not lead her to revisit this discussion of the phases of post-capitalist society? Why did Luxemburg's re-examination of Marx in the last weeks of her life not lead her to revisit his discussion of the phases of a post-capitalist society in his critique of the Gotha program? Perhaps it was due to lack of any time in the hectic period spanning from November 1918 to January 1919. Yet it may also have been... Sorry, I'm spacing out. Perhaps it was due to lack of time in the hectic period spanning from November 1918 to January 1919. Yet it may also have been that her tendency to equate spontaneous mass consciousness with the idea of socialism led her to underestimate the need to explore the conceptual sources to adequately address the content of socialism found in Marx's work. As is well known, Luxemburg rejected the claim that workers could only attain, quote, trade union consciousness, end quote, through their own endeavor. She believed that their spontaneous struggles, insofar as they heightened the class consciousness of the oppressed, could bring them to an understanding of socialism on their own. However, is class consciousness, even at its highest point of development, the same thing as an understanding of the content of socialism? Is class consciousness the same as socialist consciousness? As the Marxist-humanist writer Raya Dunayevskaya put it, quote, Luxemburg was absolutely right in her emphasis that the Marxist movement was the, quote, first in the history of class society. As Marxist-humanist writer Raya Dunayevskaya put it, quote, Luxemburg was absolutely right in her emphasis that the Marxist movement was the, quote, first in the history of class society, which reckons on the organization and independent direct action of the masses, end quote. However, Luxemburg is not right in holding that very nearly automatically it means to so total a conception of socialism that a philosophy of Marx's concept of revolution could be left to spontaneous action, end quote. Shit, I really like that. Luxemburg had a profound understanding of the role of spontaneous struggles in generating a deeper understanding of the nature of socialism. But Luxemburg's assumption that spontaneous mass consciousness necessarily or even automatically illuminates the content of a new society may have left her ill-prepared to recognize the need to explore the idea of socialism on a conceptual basis through a direct study of Marx's writings on the subject. Perhaps this also explains why she refrained from turning directly to philosophy, unlike Lenin, who engaged in a deep study of Hegel's dialectic between 1914 and 1915. Nevertheless, Luxemburg did pose the central problem of our day, the need for revolutionary democracy after the seizure of power. In so doing, she spoke to such questions as, what happens after the revolution? Is it possible to create a new society that does not lead to yet another bureaucracy? Luxemburg may not have answered these questions, and perhaps the confines of her time prevented her from doing so. After all, she did not know of Marx's 1844 manuscripts, which critiqued, quote, crude communism in the name of, quote, positive humanism. She did not know of the Grundrisse, in which Marx spoke of the, quote, union of free individuals as the essence of socialism. Luxemburg also did not know many of the writings of Marx's last decade, in which he projected the possibility that pre-capitalist societies could achieve socialism without undergoing capitalistic industrialization. Luxemburg's generation, like the, quote, classical Marxist tradition as a whole, could not have known that Marx developed a philosophy of, quote, revolution in permanence, end quote. Yet we do not have that excuse today. We now have access to the full corpus of Marx's Marxism. A powerful foundation thus exists for rethinking what is socialism as a philosophical question. When the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg is explored as part of rethinking what Marx's legacy means for us today, the vibrancy and humanism of a visionary perspective can come to life. We owe history, as well as Luxemburg herself, the attempt to at least make the effort.